So just to mention to all the participants, so if you can use Menti as well, so this is an interactive platform. You can, if you go to menti.com, so I've posted the link in the chat, you can enter the code that is on top of the slides, and you will be able to interact with the questions and the little exercises that I have in a session. So we'll be able to pull of your responses on the slide here simultaneously. So it will allow some interactivity on the slides themselves. So you can use your phone to it, you can use part of your browser to it, you can open a different tab, whichever one's convenient for you. But yeah, you can, phone is easy, just open your browser, put in a website, put in a code, and you will be in the area for this presentation. I think we'll...
You, Nadia? We need to introduce. Oh, can I introduce you?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So, hello everyone. Welcome to this workshop. And it would be nice if you could switch on your videos, the participants. I mean, if you can. So I will introduce Dr. Nadia. She's a lecturer in social psychology at the De Montfort University. She completed her BSc in psychology at Drake University and her MSc in cross-cultural psychology at Brunel. And she has a PhD with a focus on social and developmental psychology. Nadia's primary research interests lie in the field of social psychology, with a focus on self and identity processes in children and adolescents when applied in the area of mental health and psychological well being. Over to you, Nadia.
Thank you, Sanjana. Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to just, as I said, I'm going to use Menti, and this is a conversation. I'll put in some evidence and recent guidelines really around how best to adapt questionnaires and different ways that they're available to you, or how to adapt and what considerations you need to have when you're entering this process of adaptation. We've gone through this process for my MeHeLP, so I'll show you at the end how we've done it, but just kind of to walk you through. So I assume you can hear me, but just to test interactivity, you can vote now in your Menti if you can hear me or not. And again, we'll see live results there. Fantastic. Okay, so at least one person can hear me. That's good. Now, if I were to ask you, if you were to think of an average person, who would come to mind? Say average person in your head. Share in the chat, or you can speak up here. Who's an average Indian, for example? No idea? Because we do that, don't we? When we study and we use quantitative measures, we're looking for an average, right? Statistically, we're looking at means, we're looking at comparisons. Where is the mean higher, where is lower? So if you did imagine somebody in your head who is an average person, how much of these criteria did you imagine? Things like gender, their race, their ethnicity, their age, religion. Which religion did that person have? Were they Hindu? Were they Muslim? Were they Christian? Were they agnostic? Did they have a disability, your average person? What were they doing for a living? What kind of employment did they have? What were their hobbies? Were they married? Were they single? Did they have any children? How many children did they have? What is an average number of children? What did they look like? What did he look like? What did she look like? How did he dress? What was the financial situation that that average person had? How many years of education has this average person in your mind completed? How many friends did they have? So of all of these variations, when I ask a question, it's very difficult to articulate sometimes the average person in your head, but they exist, that mean average of a person. 2.5 kids, average age, etc., gender, probably very similar to yours, maybe. We have a propensity to imagine and relate to others and imagine others and ourselves as standard to some extent, a norm. But these considerations are not devout from when we're thinking about psychological constructs, when we're studying a psychological construct, when we're thinking about whether that construct will relate to somebody, will capture their experiences, will capture their understanding. We need to consider who it is we're pitching to, who it is that we want to collect data from, and what kind of things in their life that might be influenced by their understanding of those constructs. So your average person is very different, obviously, from someone else's, depending on your experience and those that are related to your culture. So your average, your impression of who it is that you want to understand will be tailored to you. So as researchers, we need to start challenging that and saying, well, how inclusive are we with our measures and with our understanding of some of those constructs? So John Berry, if we get to the methodological part of things, has done a lot of work in cross-cultural psychology, and particularly around the distinction between Etic and Emic research. And this might be very, very familiar to you. It's kind of difficult to judge because I know there's quite a diverse population of attendees today. So if this is repetitive to you, I do apologize, but hey, a bit of a rehearsal, isn't it? So in terms of Etic research, it takes an outsider's perspectives and focuses on search for human universals. So we're looking at kind of the psychic unity of humankind, right? So we're interested in what psychological constructs can we find in any context. Now, Emic research looks at insider perspective, and it looks at the way behaviors are expressed within a specific culture. So the Etic constructs will have local cultural representations. What we don't want to do when we're doing research in culture, and particularly as we have very diverse measures that are available to us, but those are predominantly developed in the West, is have an imposed Etic. Assume that our research concept and methodologies developed in one culture have the same meaning across cultural groups. So if we take a scale that was developed somewhere else, and we think it's absolutely fine to just go into a different cultural context, ignore their average person, and impose it, we need to infuse it with the Emic constructs and Emic understandings for that construct to make sense. You cannot just transplant something that is Western in a different context. So for example, we have moral judgments in all cultures. Study using measures of Kohlberg's stages of moral development across cultures is using an imposed Etic. You're assuming that Kohlberg's model is going to apply everywhere without any modifications. And if you don't find results to that, there is, you know what I mean, that culture is deficient maybe in that stage of development. It's a very dangerous assumption to make. But you're not following a proper procedure, I would say, and this is why adaptation is so important. So Emic forms of moral behavior, such as ahimsa, for example, I should you all know, if it's familiar to you, an Indian principle of non-violence based on the respect for all life, is your Emic representation of morality, of moral behavior. That is not universal. It's very much culturally specific. There's a specific term to it. You have an innate understanding of what that means. So without representing that, you're absolutely excluding that aspect of morality in your measure. So you're talking about cross-cultural research, ideally lead to derived Etic. So we'll need to derive an Etic, a universal, that has cultural representation and cultural validity, common features of Emic phenomena of that Etic construct. So if we were to think about Etics and Emic representation, so I gave you some examples. So mental health, recovery, expression of emotion, health, they're all Etics. We all kind of have emotion, we have health, we can talk about recovery. Are there any Emic representations of that within an Indian culture, for example, that you can think of? Is there anything specifically Indian in the expression of emotion? How do you do it? God, it's like being back in a lecture room.
I can only give you the way to see it. So have the appreciation to the population, how
You can put it in the chat box if you wish to.
Yeah.
That would be nice.
From the findings, Sanjana, have you found anything about mental health literacy that was very specifically Indian or specifically Emic to the culture in Kerala?
Yeah, and people say that it's an English word, but tension is
Yeah, talking a lot about tension. That term is related very much, isn't it? You'll never talk in English or in the UK about that tension.
Yes.
Absolutely. So you understand what comes with it. That term comes with strings attached very much. That when you say it to somebody in a conversation, they know exactly what you mean. Similarly, someone say, "Oh, I feel blue," having a color to the emotion, etc. Okay. I won't pull teeth. This is a democracy. So I won't be calling on people except for Sanjana. I have a bit of a relationship capital to cash in here. Great. Okay. So how do we actually do it methodologically? How do we approach this scale adaptations? So here you do need to participate. So if you are joining on Mentimeter, please do, because we'll do a bit of a quiz now, and you get winning points, so we will keep score. So please do join in. Again, it's very anonymous, but do join. We're going to do a trial of a scale right now, so it'll be nice to have some people responding. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people here. So 2 participants so far. Anybody else?
Can you please send the link for?
It's Menti. So it's on top. So if you go to menti.com, it's on top of the slide.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. And then just enter the numbers. So 85024076. Even my cat has come to join. Excellent.
Oh yeah, you must enter a code. The code is not.
There you are. All right, 3 people. Okay, well, anyone else? 4, excellent. Great. Okay, so let's start this then. If bad is written as 214, how would you write dig in the same secret writing? All right. The correct answer is 497. So we have some correct answers there. Fantastic. Next question. What does it mean if someone says she is buffed? Is it she's got a cute rear end, she's overweight, she's wearing leather, or she's polished manners. Okay. Some people have known, so well done. The correct answer is she's overweight. Next one. Which word is most out of place here? Squib, blood, grey, spook, black. Great. Fantastic. Okay. I think we'll have a couple of more, maybe. Yeah, 2 more. We will have an announcement of the winner after this. What number comes next in the sequence? 1, 2, 3. Four. Yep. The answer is many. All right. They are correct answers. So I did not make them up, I promise. I will explain where they're coming from. So we eat food and we blank water. No, the correct answer is eat. We eat food and we eat water. So why did I put you through these paces? Let me explain. First, we're going to get a leaderboard. Let's see who's done better. All right. Well, KR was the fastest and got the most right. Well done. You've won bragging points that you won the workshop quiz. Fantastic. So the questions actually that I've presented you with come from different intelligence tests. Now, if the first question is quite standard, something you might find in an intelligence test, you need to coordinate numbers with letters, and then you come up with a correct answer. Fantastic. Now, the next 2 questions came from an intelligence test designed for African Americans in the US in the 70s. And particularly involved street language and common vernacular for this group of individuals. So buffed being she's overweight and gray being out of place would only make sense to individuals that carry that culture and carry that vernacular and understanding of those terms. They made no sense to me, but I don't share that experience. The later 2 are interesting. They came from Edward River Australian Aboriginal community in North Queensland, particularly having to engage with the language of a local community. And they do not have numbers past 3, so it is many. They still use counting systems, but it's a counting system that works very differently within their culture. Also, they do not have word for drink. They talk about eating as in general. So anything to do with drinking will not translate correctly. So hopefully this gives you an impression of how to be on the receiving end of a survey that's not made for you, because it makes no sense. So psychologically, how do these surveys actually then have anything to do with measuring your intelligence? So because on this, I failed this, except for the first question, I failed it. So I'm not very intelligent according to these measures. So it's implications to our assumptions and our conclusions that we'll make that are very, very important in this case. So this psychological measurement and how we adapt and deal with psychological constructs that are quite abstract for the most part, is quite tricky. So if you feel of these kinds of tests were used, for example, a standardized intelligence test to standardize your intelligence, that determines your job, your education, your opportunities in life, it should sit uncomfortable with you. And it's because your cultural knowledge was taken for granted. The cultural intelligence that you bring to the table was completely ignored and swept under the rug. So these tests have no adequacy. If they're not adequately adapted, they are insensitive to the biases of white middle class Western perspective that has developed them. And as I said, a lot of academic literature is, again, it's biased. It's publishing things in English. It's publishing, the leading journals are in the West. Who's publishing in them? What are the surveys? And how do we reuse them? We need to be very, very critical of. And again, it's not intelligence. Intelligence, I think, is a very easy example to give, but it's mental health, it's policy, it's how we diagnose somebody, it's their treatment, using DSM criteria as gold standard, using biomedical models that are dominated in the West, again, as dominant in other contexts, is a problem because it, again, does the same thing. It invalidates the cultural experience and invalidates cultural knowledge. Okay, so this is what Porteous has done. Oh, whoops. Sorry. So Porteous in 1937, way back when, he went around and measured people intelligence as well using these finger maze tests. And he assumed that, the better you've done the maze, the faster you've done the maze, the more intelligent you did. But this is the common issue if we are like Porteous and we take Western measures and we don't adapt them. We're making three mistakes. We make a mistake of equivalence, where we assume that the way we measure something is universal, be it intelligence, be it mental health literacy. We assume that the scores are comparable and they're equivalent across different groups and has no bias. That's a problem, right? To make that assumption of equivalence. You make an assumption of generalization, that scores equal innate intelligence, that you measure scores on a measure equal their mental health level. Okay, you assume that you're measuring correctly, and it generalizes to the big construct that is quite abstract. So you're generalizing from a skill on a task to inborn qualities or to a particular state, which is problematic. And again, issues of variance. You go from sample of individuals and then to generalize to general culture. The culture is like this. And you ignoring the different levels of variance between individuals who participated and individual characteristics. Again, remember that average person was thought about at the beginning and generalizing to the whole culture. So let's not be Porteous. This is the motto of this workshop. Let's not be Porteous. Let's address it. So how do we actually adapt them properly? So you're striving for equivalence from a psychological standpoint in your adaptation process. So it's not just linguistics. I know there's a lot of back translation going on, and I'll get to it in a second. What usually happens when you develop a measure, you develop it for one language and one cultural setting, right? So generally, that's the approach. Somebody wants to develop a measure, they're not going to really put a lot of effort in doing it somewhere else with many different languages because it is hard. And I understand that. It is a lot of work. Very rarely you have simultaneous development of a construct measure that spans different languages. A good example is South African personality inventory. So this was done from an indigenous standpoint in South Africa. They've done a conceptual model of personality from interviews, and then use 11 language groups in South Africa were represented. And from that conceptual model that was shared across the 11 language groups, they then developed a measure that was universal and applicable to all of those languages. And what was interesting, they did find a similar structure to Big Five, but with a very much enhanced representation of social relational concepts that you do not see in the Big Five. So if you were just using a Big Five to study personality in other cultures, you will find Big Five. And you won't find anything else. but you will completely ignore the importance of social relationships that is crucial in a South African context. And similarly here, you know, when we're talking about Indian context, what is important? You know, if we come in with a measure that's developed somewhere else, yes, we might find stuff on it, but we'll ignore anything that's not included. So the question is, what do we need to include? So your translation can take three forms: adoption, adaptation, and assembly. Okay. Adoption is your straightforward, close translation of the measures, right? So you've taken a Western measure, you've translated into a different language, in Hindi or Malayalam, and you run with it because the words translated, you assume the construct has done. Okay. That's option one. Option two is adoption, when you take the original measure and you change something in the terms, you change the items to fit the idioms and the norms and the values within the cultural group that you're adapting it to. And a third is assembly, where you add certain parts or you administer it in a way that is suitable to the location. So remember, the adaptation of measures is not just the content, but the process as well. So you're doing an adaptation of how it is applicable to do a survey in a particular context. So in a tribal context, it will be very different to if you would do it in a city, right? So again, here it's going from very little to quite a bit of modifications to a scale. How do you choose between them? Well, it's basically, what bias do you expect to find? That's the question. So if you think that whatever measure that you're using as an original is biased, be it in how it represents a construct, for example, mental health might be represented very biomedically, something that is accepted and appropriate in the West and it isn't here, it has a construct bias. So if there's a method bias in kind of how it's written, how it's administered, again, it's not appropriate to do just adoption and literal translation of measures because you're perpetuating that bias in your scale. Now, if only very few of the items you think might be biased, the best thing is to translate, because then you're improving comparability between the measures. So you can say, let's do cross-cultural comparisons, the measures are the same, we don't have any biases, and as a consequence, we can run with it. Generally, you will find some bias. So you will very rarely find just straight adoption and translation methods for surveys. How do you do it? Now, Van der Wyver is a fantastic researcher in cross-cultural research, and they've basically introduced the different domains where you can do adaptation, be it the concepts themselves, what you're studying, for example, mental health literacy, you know, any of those constructs, a particular measure, for example, for depression or dementia or anything like that, you know, that you're looking at in your own research. So you're looking at it around how the concept itself functions, and will that be understood in a scale. You also look at cultural adaptations. So it's hard and soft. So is it particular specific cultural idioms as well as cultural norms that are represented? You can look for language, again, hard and soft, in terms of particular terms that are used. For example, friend might mean male and female, or might not in different languages, but also about kind of particular accommodation around how conversation is used, how language is used in a particular context. And again, measurement, because we do know that answering scales has, the cultures have response styles. Some people are very extreme, some people kind of stick in the middle. You know, there's certain aspects of response styles that we see as well. So you can adapt for that. So again, it's knowing what you need to adapt for. What is the topic? Who are your people? And by the way, I'm quite happy to share the PDFs and stuff with anybody in the workshop. Just email me and I'll send those things to you because it has some references. Traditional adaptations that you kind of see go from forward translation to desired language using a comparison of the two versions by an independent translator who is bilingual. You then might blindly back translate. You will do a comparison then of two back translated versions. You will do some pilot testing. And of course, you will be using good psychometrics like exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis to understand the structure. That you see a lot, but at the moment, the back translation is a bit of a contentious issue because it, again, deals only with the linguistic aspect of things as opposed to the meaning of terms. So remember that cultural adaptation to values and norms. So committee approach is a lot more common now as opposed to back translating questionnaires. And this is sort of the modern thinking in the area is around actually using a committee of people to understand the constructs, both from a linguistic as well as a cultural perspective. And always having qualitative and quantitative aspects to your research. You need interviews, you need to engage with the community, you need to talk about the measures. You can't just treat it as a linguistic exercise because you're losing that. All of those things that we've said are problematic, you're losing that. Now, there, for example, Bristling does quite a bit of work in terms of, and there's a reference for you, in terms of how to change some of the wordings and best practice on kind of how to change wordings, how to use nouns, etc. That will be more culturally appropriate and easier to translate, less likely to enter this vague territory of what does this mean. And we've had a lot of that, didn't we, Sanjana, when we were adapting? Well, somebody doesn't understand this, somebody understands that. So when Kohler did a research on a quality of life translation of a survey into 60 languages, so this is why linguistic translations just don't work. First of all, semantic issues, terms like bothered or quite a lot, have very different meanings and they're very difficult to quantify for people. What does bothered mean? You know, how do you translate the word bothered and the meaning that it has in English into a different language? It becomes very, very difficult. So using terms like that in a survey prevents it from being kind of understood by all. You have cultural constructs within the survey, like, for example, quality of life is eating fresh food. It's not necessarily applicable in an Indian or Thai context because of the kind of diet that the context has. So you've just completely alienated and you're measuring quality of life that is not sensitive to the cultural practice and your context. So that item will indicate low quality of life while it actually only just reflects the cultural norm. So again, our assumptions and conclusions that we'll draw from this will be wrong. And they had some technical and typo issues as well. So for that, there are guidelines. So again, there's resources for you if you want to go and adapt surveys properly. There are guidelines for you of how you can do it. Now, summarize them for you. So again, there's links and references there if you want to go and look at the whole thing. You need to work in multidisciplinary teams because you have people that benefit from different perspectives on the concept. How somebody views identity, how somebody views mental health and what's important to it will challenge and make you as a researcher come out of that shell of assuming what you know is the norm. And it's nice to have that at this point because you will adapt it not to yourself, but to others. And with that in mind, you need to combine the linguistic and cultural with statistical evidence. So your adaptation doesn't stop at, I've translated it, I've adapted the items, I've done some interviews. It's all very culturally sensitive and informed. At the end of your piloting comes exploratory and confirmatory structure analysis. You need to understand what the numbers are telling you. So you can't force the numbers to give you the structure that you want or the subscales that you want. You need to be quite open to see how do they interact with each other. Maybe things that you assumed correlated just don't. And why doesn't it? So that all of that carries meaning. So it comes hand in hand with the adaptation, kind of having the analysis at the end that speak to the rigorousness of the process. And transparency, so documenting what you do is important. So we can actually see and trace. So we have a very, very long document for MeHeLP in terms of how we've gone through our process. And we will be publishing that hopefully in the near future. So some final thoughts. So just give you an example of what we've done in MeHeLP. We had a committee translation of the English MeHeLP to Malayalam. We had new items derived by the team from the interviews. We have synthesized them with the measures and cut them down. There's a lot of debate around which ones to use, how do we word them, etc. The researchers have done cognitive interviews across all contexts. So as I mentioned in my presentation, we had 8 sites. So they went with a survey, and the way you do cognitive interviews, and Sanjana can comment to this as well, she's done them. What does this mean to you? What don't you understand about this? What is problematic in the wording of this? Again, you can kind of run away with it as kind of academic culture, isn't it? So you need to take it back to the people that you want to get the information from and say, does it make sense to you? With your level of literacy, with your experience, with your language, with your vernacular, with your particular local terms, does this make sense? And again, we've pulled this together and had a debate of like, okay, well, this doesn't make sense to everybody. How can we change this, etc. And you can have that conversation with the participants in that time as well. Revision, we've piloted, we've done factor analysis. We're now piloting it again, a shorter version, but we're linking it to related constructs and different constructs to see how it functions in the world of psychology or in the world of mental health. Does it relate to the things it should relate to? Does it not relate to things it shouldn't relate to? So essentially, you need to be careful in your instrument design to avoid bias. This is your driving point, right? So you need to accept that whatever measure you're adopting comes with a level of bias. You need to understand what that bias is and how much work on it do you need to do to make sense to the people that you're doing it with. Multicultural teams help, particularly for the local cultural and linguistic input. Have a committee approach, talk to each other, have discussions around it. It's not a lone wolf process. You need to have many voices. You need to challenge and critique your own worldview as you're doing this. You need to very much accept that your perspective isn't the right one. So you need to find a consensus. An average. Again, we've started with an average, didn't we? Transparency of the procedure. Document what you do, document your decisions, document why you've made them, how many people have put in, etc. It's useful to have manuals for translators, particularly if you're using people who aren't familiar with the constructs. So you have those descriptions for them so they can engage with them. Doing cognitive interviews are being increasingly important. You could do them at different stages. You can do your psychometrics and go back to the second round of interviews. If you have all the time in the world and all the resources, we would have done, we couldn't, because some items just don't work when you do the factor analysis. And that question why might be answered by people like, well, you take it back and say, well, this didn't work. Does it fit in here? Does it not fit in here? And then again, you talk to people about it. And piloting in relative steps. Any thoughts? I think we have about 15 minutes, is it, Sanjana, till the next session? We can spend some time. I know it was kind of a quick run through, and as I said, I'm very happy to share these resources. If you just email me, I will send them to you. But if you have any questions or reflections, in terms of the session, please do share them either via Menti or in chat, or feel free to unmute yourself. I'm going to shut up now.
You can text your email ID.
Yes. Is this useful? Is it clear? Do you need some clarifications on this? Maybe, I don't know if you are doing an adaptation now that you're kind of trying to think through. Do you know how much time we have, Sanjana? You're on mute.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I was a little late to join, but anyway, the session was very helpful. Basically, it was I love the session, and I haven't gone through the MHLP material, especially the one you were talking about, the translator or the adapted one. But the experience, like my experience with the adapted or modified Indian version, is with the TAT, the thematic apperception test, which was adapted by Uma Chowdhury. Like it was there for our uh, course. It was there in our course, so we have to analyze that. So even though we haven't had a theoretical perspective into the adaptation and all, after your session I got a little bit idea about how the theoretical part, like how we have to, like what are the precautions and what are the things we need to be aware while doing adaptation. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's knowing what the biases might be, and there's construct, there's what. Again, it's thinking through, and there's systems to this, isn't it? Your construct bias, your method bias. It's going through and checking what assumptions am I making, because we always make them. What would people understand? What can they connect to? We make those assumptions all the time. So when it gives you kind of thinking, okay, think about language. How do people use language? If you're adapting it and you're using currencies or weights or distances, are you saying it in the way that they understand it? Are you using metric or imperial, or you see what I mean? Like you can run into kind of some of those misconceptions. A lot of languages, for example, have an honorary or kind of informal Russian has that. French has that. What kind of language do you use? What kind of norms do you include in it? So I think particularly if I go back, let me just exit and come back.
Hi, Nadia. I think we have to.
Do we need to go?
Yes.
Okay.
In 2 minutes. So yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
It's 6:40.
Okay, I'll just highlight this then. I think it's no. Sorry. This one, I think. Nope. Sorry, this one. Yeah. So from this publication, and particularly this table will give you some of the ways in which you can look at adaptation. So either from the language, from the cultural perspective. So is it about conversion of currency? Is it about avoidance of loss of face? So some constructs might be very much culturally embedded. Like if I talk about ahimsa, for example, and a measure in the UK, nobody will understand. So it's about proofreading it from that. I was talking about tension. So when you're talking about mental health, should you be talking using the words that make sense to your community in your measure? So you're actually tapping into some of that cultural knowledge, not completely brushing it off and cleaning it off, because you're not inclusive then. You're not capturing that construct. We're always limited, and I think that's part of the problem of generalizability. If you think about mental health, if you think about depression, right? So if we get an example of depression, how that looks like to people, to individuals, very, very different. Right? How it presents, the symptomatology, the causes, the behaviors, the help seeking, the stigma, all of that, very, very complex, very different presentation. How do you distill that to 12 statements in a survey? How do you distill that massive construct into 12 statements that's going to capture its entirety? It's very difficult, and you won't be able to, but it's finding that best representation. So I think we need to be very careful to say our measures are not perfect, but it's how do we make them suitable so we make the right conclusions.
So, Nadia?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there is a question, but I think we need to end the session now.
Yeah.
So,
ICD 11 scales and personality. I think they need to make more focused. Again, it's not translation. If it's biased and it doesn't represent local culture, I think you need to adopt. I think translation is very limited scope in actually making a construct relevant to culture. So I would always supplement that with interviews, talk about the personality aspects, and then see if you're actually being captured. So it might be useful to look at the conceptual model, and if that represents, and build a series of interviews around a conceptual model of personality in India, and then see what your findings and themes from those interviews, do they actually match the items that you're trying to use? If your themes that you're finding are not represented, then you need to create items for that to be captured, essentially. And you might retain the old ones, but you might supplement it with it. So MHLQ was supplemented with a lot of spiritual stuff that was not there because it's a biomedical model. It's a Western measure. And we have developed items that represented spiritual and religious healing and recovery because that was part of people's literacy and their understanding. So we couldn't ignore it. So we developed a new one.
yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, Nadia. I think we have to leave now.
Sorry.
All of us.
Okay, thank you for joining, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Okay,
Thank you,
bye.
everyone.